They say blood is thicker than water. That comforting lie crumbled when a hospital blood test revealed the child I raised wasn't mine. I lay in that bed, my son Robert waiting for a donor match. When the truth landed, 30 years ago, our babies were switched. But the real discovery happened at dinner, where the waiter Robert disdained was my biological son. Subscribe now. This story has a twist you'll never see coming. My name is Thomas Cortland. For 45 years, I built Cortland Manufacturing from a single machine shop into a logistics empire with 3,000 employees. I controlled markets, balance sheets, and every detail of my public image. But I could never control my son Robert, not his entitlement, not the cruel way he treated people beneath him. That failure would cost me everything. The night before my collapse, Robert humiliated a waiter at a charity dinner. I said nothing. 48 hours later, I was in a hospital bed, and a nurse told me my son's blood wasn't a match. The real nightmare was only beginning. The charity dinner was held at the Grand Waverly downtown, an annual event for pediatric cancer research that I'd been sponsoring for 15 years. I wore a bespoke charcoal suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Robert wore a smirk. He always wore a smirk, as if the world was a slightly disappointing gift he'd been forced to unwrap. That night, he was particularly poisonous. He spent the first half of dinner cataloging the failures of the staff, the crumb on the fork, the 2-minute delay on the second course, the nervous sommelier who mispronounced a Rene Valley vintage. I watched him reduce a young woman to near tears over a water glass that wasn't refilled to his exact specification. And I said nothing. I'd been saying nothing for 3 decades. Robert was 31 years old. He had graduated from a private university I paid for, spent 3 years in the company doing almost nothing, and then been handed a vice presidency title that came with a corner office and exactly 0 accountability. I told myself I was preparing him for leadership. The truth is, I was avoiding a fight. After his mother died, ovarian cancer, Robert was 11, I parented him with distance and checkbooks. I was busy building an empire. By the time I realized the boy had hollowed out into someone who measured people by their utility, it felt too late. I wish I could tell you I loved him unconditionally. I told myself I did, but love without respect curdles into something you carry out of obligation. At the dinner, the dessert course brought a moment that still rings in my head like a sharp note. Robert ordered the flourless chocolate torte. The waiter who brought it, a quiet man, mid-30s, dark hair, careful hands, accidentally brushed Robert's shoulder with the edge of the plate. It left no mark, no spill, a fraction of contact. Robert turned in his chair, looked at the man's name tag, and said, loud enough for the entire table to hear, "Simon." "Was that your name?" "Simon, I assume you have a supervisor nearby who can explain the concept of personal space. Fetch them." Now, Simon didn't flinch. He apologized once, calmly, with a dignity that I should have recognized. He looked at me for a fraction of a second, not pleading, just looked, and I dropped my eyes to my dessert fork. I did nothing. After the manager had been summoned and Simon had been publicly dressed down, Robert smirked again. "Some people just aren't made for service," he said. The table chuckled nervously. I pushed my plate away and said nothing. I drove home that night with a heaviness in my chest that I mistook for shame. At 3 in the morning, I woke in a cold sweat, left arm numb, jaw clenched. I knew immediately. A massive coronary. My housekeeper found me on the floor at 7 a.m. Paramedics shocked me back to rhythm in the ambulance. At Midlands Medical Center, the cardiologist, Dr. Langhorne sat next to my bed while I dripped with tubes and told me the damage was extensive. "We need to replace a valve," she said. "The ideal blood donor for a platelet match is a first-degree relative. Your son is on his way." I was floating on morphine and something close to prayer when Robert arrived. Not at the bedside, I could hear him in the hallway, arguing with a phlebotomist about the indignity of having his blood drawn in a shared facility. I closed my eyes. When the nurse finally brought him in, he looked inconvenienced, as if my heart attack had been scheduled without his approval. "They took 4 vials," he said, rubbing his arm. "I hope that's enough." I thanked him. He nodded. Then he checked his phone. 6 hours later, Dr. Langhorne returned. She didn't have the relaxed smile she wore for good news. She pulled the privacy curtain and sat down heavily. That's when you know. That small gesture, a doctor sitting without being asked, is the quietest alarm bell on earth. "Mr. Cortland," she said, "we ran a full compatibility panel. Blood type, antigens, law markers. There is no biological pathway by which Robert is your son. None, we've double-checked. The DINA excludes it." I stared at her. My chest hurt, and not from the incision site. Somewhere in the back of my morphine-smoothed brain, I thought of Simon the waiter's face. And I thought, the world does not tilt without warning. But I had been ignoring the warning for 31 years. What the doctor said next snapped everything into focus. "If you've raised Robert from birth, Mr. Cortland, then we need to consider something else. Your child was likely switched with another infant at the hospital where he was delivered. Right now, somewhere, your biological son is walking around not knowing you exist." She paused. "And whoever he is, his blood could be the one that saves your life." The words hung in the sterile air like a verdict I hadn't known was being deliberated. "Your biological son." I stared at the privacy curtain, my mind refusing to accept the shape of it. I'd spent 4 decades building supply chains that never broke. Backup plans for backup plans. And yet, the most fundamental inventory of my own life was wrong. Robert wasn't mine. The boy I'd raised, the man who'd sneered at a waiter a week ago, belonged to someone else. And somewhere out there, my actual blood was walking around with my genetic code and no reason to love me. Dr. Langhorne left me with a chart of treatment options. The valve replacement could be postponed with medication and monitoring, but the window was narrow. Without a compatible donor for the platelet transfusion, surgery carried a mortality rate that made me swallow hard, and the most compatible blood would come from a direct relative, the son I'd never met. It wasn't just about closure. It was about staying alive long enough to fix what I'd broken. That shifted something. All my life, I'd solved problems by throwing money and lawyers at them until the obstacle gave way. This would be the most important deal I'd ever close, and I had to close it fast. The lawyer I called first wasn't my usual corporate counsel. Arthur Pennington was a private family attorney, the kind who handled the things that never made it into board minutes. We'd met once before, when an old business rival attempted to manufacture a paternity claim. Arthur had dismantled it with the efficiency of a man packing a suitcase. "Thomas," he said when I explained the situation, his voice even, "the statutes on switched birth cases are a tangle. But you don't need a lawsuit. You need a bloodhound." He gave me the name Leland Cross. Retired FBI, 15 years out of the bureau, specializing in finding people who don't want to be found. "He's discreet, and he's fast," Arthur said. "Both will matter more than you think." I made the call from my hospital bed, IV still in my wrist, monitors beeping softly behind me. Leland listened without interrupting, then said 3 words, "I'll start tonight." The next morning, Robert arrived with a fruit basket and a stack of unread earnings reports. He glanced at the monitors, then at me and said, "You look terrible." It was the closest he'd come to affection in years. I almost told him then. I looked at his face, the same narrow chin, the same pale eyes that had come from my late wife, and realized with a fresh stab that whatever biology said, he was hers. That made it worse. I kept my mouth shut. "They're releasing me tomorrow," I said. "Light duty for a month, then I'm back in the office." He nodded, already losing interest. "Good. The board's asking about the Midwest expansion." I almost laughed. My heart had nearly stopped, and he was worried about the board. But that was Robert. That was exactly who he'd become. And I had to face the possibility that I'd let him become that, because somewhere deep in my subconscious, I'd never fully claimed him as my own. I'm not sure I even knew that until the words are forming now. Leland Cross moved like a man who had been promised a puzzle and was already half in love with its difficulty. He visited me at home, sitting in my study with a thick leather folder and a voice that was all business. "St. Luke's Hospital closed in 1985, he said. Records were archived at a county storage facility. The good news, births from 1971 were transferred to microfiche before they shut down. The bad news, a fire in '93 damaged about 6% of the files. We got lucky. Your records survived." He spread black and white photocopies on the mahogany desk. I saw my wife's name, Elizabeth Cortland, and the date, November 14th, 1971. A boy, 8 pounds 2 ounces. And then another entry, right below it, same date, same obstetrician. Margaret Doyle, age 19, single, A boy, 7 pounds 11 ounces. No father listed. Leland tapped the second entry. There were only 2 male births that day at St. Luke's. One of them was your wife's child. The other was Margaret Doyle's. That means if a switch occurred, and the medical records suggest the nursery was overcrowded and understaffed that weekend, then the infant you took home is Margaret Doyle's son, and the child Margaret took home is yours. He paused, letting the words settle. I ran a preliminary trace. Margaret Doyle married a man named Henry Keller in 1979. She passed away in '98. Her son, her legal son, is named Simon Keller. Mid-30s, lives in the city. No criminal record, clean credit, employed. He opened a second folder, and my breath stopped before he even turned the photograph around. "I know this face," I said. Leland raised an eyebrow. "That's Simon Keller. Currently works as a waiter at the Grand Waverly Hotel." He slid the photo across the desk. Dark hair. Careful hands. Quiet dignity. The man I'd watched my son Robert humiliate over a dessert plate 7 days ago. The universe doesn't deal in coincidences. It deals in long, slow arcs that crash into your chest when you least expect it. I had dropped my eyes to my fork, while my own flesh and blood stood there, absorbing contempt dressed as refinement. And now that same man, that same patient, composed stranger, held the blood that could save my life. But he didn't know he was a Cortland. And after what I'd allowed Robert to do to him, why would he ever want to be? I looked at Leland Cross, who was watching me with the quiet patience of a man who delivered 100 impossible truths in his career. "Find out everything about him," I said, "and do it before my heart finishes what it started." Leland Cross called me 3 days later, at 6 in the morning. His voice was flat, the way it got when he'd found something he didn't like. "I've got the dossier on Simon Keller. But there's a complication." I was sitting in my study, a blanket over my knees because my circulation hadn't fully returned to normal. The medication made me cold. I poured coffee from a thermos and said, "Tell me everything. I don't pay you to keep me comfortable." He exhaled once, a short, hard breath, and began. Simon Keller is 33 years old. He lives in a one-bedroom walk-up on the south side, 2 bus transfers from the Grand Waverly. He's held the waiter position for 6 years, no complaints on file, tipped regularly, but never excessively. Before that, he worked double shifts at a warehouse while putting himself through community college, business administration, never finished, dropped out in his second year when his grandmother fell ill. Margaret Doyle died in 1998, but she had an aunt, Lorraine, who raised Simon after that. Lorraine is 84 now, bedbound with Parkinson's. Simon is her sole caregiver. He changes her sheets, administers her medications, and works the dinner shift to afford a home health aide for the hours he's gone. He does not drink, does not smoke, and has never been in a police database. His credit score is excellent, not because he has money, but because he's terrified of debt. He volunteers at a food bank on Tuesdays. He writes poetry no one's ever read. I sat listening, the coffee going cold in my hand. Every detail was a small nail being driven into some soft place I'd ignored my whole life. I had spent decades grading men on their spreadsheets and their boardroom presence, and this man, this son, had been quietly outworking every executive I'd ever hired, with nothing to show for it but a sick old woman who depended on him. And I had let my other son crush him over a dessert plate. The complication, Leland said after a pause, is his blood type. I set the mug down. Go on. Bell negative. Same as yours. It's extraordinarily rare. About 1 in 800 people carry it, and it's a near-perfect match to your La profile, better than any anonymous donor in the registry. If anyone is going to be your platelet donor, Simon Keller is the ideal candidate. But he's also the only one we can't compel. There it was. The universe had designed a perfect lock and then handed me the key with a note that said, "Good luck asking." I could subpoena a stranger, but not the man I'd already wronged. I spent the next 2 days trying to decide how to approach him. I wrote 3 drafts of a letter, then burned all of them. I rehearsed a phone call in my bathroom mirror and hated how I sounded. Entitled, Fragile, the same voice Robert used when he demanded a seat upgrade. I needed to stand in front of him, not as Thomas Cortland the industrialist, but as a man. No lawyers, no letters, no corporate distance. So I made a reservation at the Grand Waverly. Table 14, the one in the corner where I'd sat during the charity dinner. It felt like walking back into the scene of a crime, which is exactly what it was. That evening, I dressed down deliberately. No jacket. A simple gray sweater my housekeeper had picked up from a department store. No cufflinks. I wanted him to see a person, not a predator. When I walked in, the maître d' recognized me and rushed forward. But I stopped him with a hand. "Simon Keller," I said, "I'd like him to serve my table tonight." The man's expression flickered. He remembered the incident, the complaint. The manager who'd had to discipline an employee in front of a room full of wealthy donors, but he nodded because I was Thomas Cortland, and my name still bent rules. I hate that I used it. I hate that I didn't have another way. Simon approached the table with the careful calm I remembered, the kind that doesn't come from servility, but from exhaustion so deep it wraps around to composure. He set a water glass in front of me and pulled out a notepad. "Good evening, Mr. Cortland. Can I start you with something to drink?" He didn't blink. He knew who I was. He remembered everything. But here's the part that stopped me. He wasn't afraid, and he wasn't angry. He was just present, professional, giving me exactly the service I'd paid for. That quiet dignity was more damning than any outburst. I had reduced my son to this, a transaction. "Simon," I said, and my voice caught. I hadn't planned for that. I cleared my throat. I'm not here to order dinner. He waited, pen still ready. I owe you an apology. A real one, not the kind you give to move on. The way my son spoke to you last week was unacceptable, and I sat there and allowed it. That shame belongs to me. I want you to know that I see it. He inclined his head slightly, just a fraction. Accept it, he said. Will there be anything else? The word arrived without warmth, which I deserved. Yes, I said. There's something else. I need you to listen to me for 5 minutes. After that, you never have to look at me again. He folded the notepad and slipped it into his apron. I have tables. I'll compensate the restaurant for the inconvenience. He stared at me, and I saw it then, the faintest crack in the armor, a glimmer of curiosity. He sat down opposite me, uninvited, and I realized he'd been waiting for something from me I didn't have a name for. I told him about November 14th, 1971, St. Luke's Hospital. The 2 baby boys born within an hour of each other. The fire that nearly destroyed the records. The Dina exclusion that shattered my world. I told him who Margaret Doyle was, and that I believed his entire life was the result of a nurse's error or a nursery understaffed beyond its limits. I told him I'd been looking for my biological son. And then I said the words that made his face go blank. I believe that son is you. The silence that followed could have cracked the table in 2. Simon didn't move. He looked at me the way you look at a stranger who's suddenly stepped too close. A mix of disbelief and the very beginning of something worse. I have a mother, he said. Margaret Keller was my mother. She raised me. She loved me. She died when I was 16, and she never once hinted. His voice broke, then hardened. You're mistaken. I pulled the Dina compatibility overview from my jacket, the one Dr. Langhorne had provided, and set it between us. Biology doesn't replace Margaret. Nothing ever will. She was your mother in every way that matters. But she isn't here to answer the question, and I am. And I need you to know the truth because my life depends on it. I explained the heart surgery, the platelet match, the 1 in 800 rarity. I'm not asking for your love, I said. I'm not asking you to accept me as your father. I'm asking you to consider saving my life. Not because I deserve it, but because the fact that you exist is the only thing that's made sense to me in weeks. Simon stood up abruptly, the chair scraping the floor. A few heads turned. He pressed both hands flat on the table and leaned toward me. You come here after 33 years. You say that the man I served dessert to, the same man who humiliated me in front of a dozen people, is my biological father. And you want my blood. Do you hear how that sounds? I held his gaze. Yes, it sounds monstrous. He flinched, just slightly. But the monster isn't your biology. The monster is the situation. And the only way I can fix any of it is to be honest with you right now, no matter what it costs me. He straightened up, and for a long moment he studied my face, maybe looking for a resemblance, maybe just processing. Then his expression shifted. Something cold and bitter emerged from beneath the calm. I looked you up, he said quietly. After that night I went home and I searched your name. I wanted to know what kind of man raises a son like Robert Cortland. And you know what I found? Philanthropy galas, hospital wings, scholarships, but also labor disputes, hostile takeovers, employees who said you fired them without severance while you bought a 3rd vacation home. You've spent a lifetime deciding who matters and who doesn't. And your son, your biological son or not, acts exactly like you. So tell me again why I should believe you're different. I tried to answer, but my chest tightened. Not from the surgery this time. From the precision of it. He wasn't wrong. Robert was my reflection, sharpened to a cruelty I'd never dared to commit out loud. But the instinct to compartmentalize, to treat people as assets, to win at any cost, that was my code. I had never apologized for it until this week, and even now I wasn't sure I was apologizing or just desperate. Before I could speak, Simon shook his head. "I'll do the test. Not because you deserve my help, but because you were right about one thing. My mother isn't here to tell me the truth. If I carry your blood, then I want to know it. For her sake, not yours." He turned without another word and walked toward the kitchen. I sat there, the Dina page still on the table, my heart beating against the memory of a scalpel. I had opened a door, but behind it was a room full of knives, and I still hadn't seen the worst of them. That came 3 hours later, when Robert stormed into my house without knocking. He'd heard something. Maybe from the Maitre d', maybe from a gossip chain, and he was vibrating with a fury I'd never seen in him. "You're telling people I'm not your son? You're chasing down some waiter with a sob story while I'm trying to hold this company together?" He was shouting in my living room, his tie loose, his face flushed. "What is this? Some midlife crisis? You almost die and now you want a better air?" I stood slowly, the blanket falling from my shoulders. "Robert, sit down." He didn't. "You had no right," he said, his voice cracking. "I am your son. Everything I've ever done was to be worthy of that name. And you're throwing it away for Dina." He looked at me then with something more than anger, with betrayal. And for the first time I saw that beneath the smirk and the entitlement was a terror of being unclaimed. "Robert," I said, as evenly as I could, "you are still my son. But you need to hear something you've avoided your whole life." I stepped closer. "The waiter you humiliated. His name is Simon Keller, and the hospital where you were born made a mistake. He is my biological son. And you," I paused, because the next words would detonate everything, "you are still my wife's child. Nothing changes that. But you are not mine by blood. And I have to find a way to live with both truths." His face went gray. For a beat, I thought he would break. Then his expression hardened into something far more dangerous. Calculation. "If he's your real son," Robert said slowly, "then he has a claim to this estate, to the company, to everything I've been preparing to inherit. That's what this is really about, isn't it?" I didn't answer, because some small, shameful part of me had already done that math. "I'll fight you," Robert said. "If you try to bring him into this family, I will take you to court. I'll challenge every legal document. I'll tie this up for a decade. I will not lose my birthright to a mistake." He turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. I was left in the silence, the blanket still at my feet. 2 sons. One who just made it clear he valued my estate more than my life, and one who'd asked only for the truth. Tomorrow, Simon would take the Ditna test. If it confirmed he was mine, I would have to choose, protect the legacy I'd built with Robert's name on it, or risk everything to bring my true son into a world that had already rejected him. But the real knife in the chest was that I wasn't sure which choice made me the bigger monster, the one who kept his money, or the one who gave it up. And either way, my heart might not survive the surgery. That's when the phone rang. Doctor, Langhorne's number. She'd found something in my latest scan, something she would only tell me in person. The universe, it seemed, wasn't done sharpening its blades. "Doctor." Langhorne's office smelled of antiseptic and old coffee. She had my latest echocardiogram on the screen before I even sat down. "The left ventricular ejection fraction has dropped below 30%, she said. "If we don't replace the valve within 4 weeks, the muscle damage will be irreversible. Even with surgery, you're facing a long recovery. But without a compatible platelet donor, the procedure carries a 50% mortality risk. She turned the monitor toward me. The image showed my own failing heart, a grainy gray sac fluttering where it should have pumped. "Where are you with the biological son?" she asked. I hadn't told her about the dinner, the confrontation, Robert's threat. I just said, "We're confirming the match." She nodded, not quite believing me. "Then confirm it fast. Because your body is no longer a backup plan." The drive home from the clinic was a slow-motion blur. I passed the warehouse district I'd built, the office tower with my name on the plaque, and none of it felt like mine. I was a temporary custodian of assets that had stopped being important the night a doctor said your son isn't your son. The only thing that mattered now was whether Simon Keller would give me a chance I didn't deserve. Leland Cross called with the DNA results the next morning. "It's a 99.99% match," he said. "Simon Keller is your biological son." No question. I was standing in my kitchen, early light slanting across the floor. I'd been expecting the words, but they still hit like a second heart attack. I thanked Leland, hung up, and sat at the kitchen table for a long time, watching the dust float in the sun. Some men find out they have a hidden fortune. I'd found a son who changed bedpans for a dying woman while I signed checks for charity galas. That afternoon, I gathered the legal papers Arthur Pennington had prepared, a formal acknowledgement of paternity, a waiver of all claims to the Cortland estate unless voluntarily offered, and a medical consent form for the platelet donation. I didn't bring the trust fund documents. Not yet. I'd learn from my mistakes, or I'd die trying. I called Simon's cell phone, a number Leland had included, and when he answered, his voice was guarded but not hostile. "I have the results," I said. "Can we meet somewhere that isn't a restaurant?" There was a long pause. "There's a park near my apartment, Fulton Playground. 2:00. He hung up before I could thank him. The playground was nearly empty, just a few children on the swings and a tired mother pushing a stroller. Simon sat on a bench near the water fountain, wearing a worn canvas jacket. He looked younger in the daylight, less armored. I sat down beside him, leaving a careful distance. "It's confirmed," I said. "You're my son by biology. I have the DNA report if you want to see it." He took the paper, scanned it, folded it again with steady hands. "I already knew," he said quietly. "I found a letter from my mother in a box of old papers. She wrote it when she was sick, but she never sent it. She said the hospital told her there might have been a mix-up, but she didn't want to disrupt my life. She carried that secret to her grave." He looked at me. "So you're not the only one who's been living with a lie." That detail, a mother's terrified mercy, leveled something in me. Margaret Doyle had known, or suspected, and had chosen to love the child she had rather than chase the one she'd lost. I'd spent 3 decades ignoring my conscience while she'd spent the same decades quietly protecting a boy who wasn't hers to begin with. The contrast made my chest hollow. "I'm not here to demand anything," I said. "But the surgery I need, without your platelets, I may not survive. I've brought a medical consent form. You're under no obligation. If you say no, I'll walk away and you'll never hear from me again." I placed the paper on the bench between us. Simon didn't touch it. He looked at the children playing, the swings creaking. "Why did you sit there quietly while Robert humiliated me?" he asked, not turning his head. "You could have stopped it." The question was quiet, but it landed like a fist. I had no prepared speech for that moment. "Because I was a coward," I said. "Because I'd spent my life training myself not to feel, and by the time I realized my own child was turning into a monster, I'd already lost the muscle to stop him. That failure is mine. It's not a justification, it's just the truth. Simon finally picked up the consent form. He read every line, including the warnings about risks and recovery. Then he pulled a pen from his jacket and signed it. I'll donate. Not for your forgiveness, and not because you're my biological father. I'll do it because my mother, Margaret, taught me that helping someone who's dying is never a mistake, even if they don't deserve it. He handed me the paper. Once you're out of surgery, we can decide if there's anything else worth salvaging. But until then, this is just a medical transaction. I nodded, unable to speak. The dignity he kept showing was a mirror I couldn't look away from. That was when my phone buzzed. Arthur Pennington's number. I stepped away to take it, and he told me what Robert had done. He's filed an emergency injunction to prevent any Dina-based claim against the Cortland estate. He's also frozen the company's legal department, claiming you're medically incapacitated and that he's the acting CEO. The board is in chaos. I looked back at Simon, still sitting on the bench, folding his jacket sleeve. In the space of a single afternoon, I'd found one son willing to save my life and watch the other try to dismantle everything I'd built before I was even dead. Let him, I told Arthur. Let him burn his own bridges. I have a surgery to schedule. The operation was set for Monday, 6 days away. I spent that week in a strange suspension, heart monitors strapped to my chest, my lawyer drafting papers to remove Robert from executive authority, and Simon Keller, quietly, without fanfare, sending a message through Leland that he wanted to meet again before the procedure. We met at the same park 5 days before surgery. This time he brought a small photograph. His mother, Margaret, young, holding a baby wrapped in a hospital blanket. You should know what she looked like, he said. She was a good person who made a hard choice. She doesn't deserve to be erased by a hospital error. I looked at her face, tired but kind, a 19-year-old girl who'd raised a stranger's son, and for the first time, I felt something other than panic. I felt gratitude. She gave me the only decent thing I'm going to leave behind, I said. You. He bristled at that. But I held up a hand. I'm not assigning you inheritance. I'm saying that whatever you've become, the discipline, the compassion, the way you take care of your grandmother, that's not from me. That's from her. And if I survive, I'd like to spend the rest of my life honoring that. He didn't smile, but the tension in his shoulders eased a fraction. The day of the surgery, Robert showed up at the hospital. He'd been stripped of his emergency powers by the board, and his face was a ruin of anger and something else, grief he didn't know how to carry. You're really going through with this, he said, standing at the foot of my bed, risking your life so a stranger's blood can save you. I looked at the young man I'd raised with everything except the tools to be decent. He's not a stranger. He's my son. And you are too, by your mother's blood, if not mine. But you have to decide if you're going to keep treating family like a hostile takeover. Robert's jaw tightened. I'm trying to protect what's mine. No, I said, the sedation beginning to soften the edges of my voice. You're trying to protect yourself from the idea that you might not be the center of the story. That's not the same thing at all. They wheeled me into surgery just after 8. The last thing I remember is Simon, seated in the pre-op area, already hooked to the apheresis machine. His blood was moving through clear tubing into a bag, a slow red current. He looked at me, and for the first time, there was no distance in his eyes. Just survive, he said. We'll figure out the rest. I closed my eyes and let the anesthesia swallow me. I woke 27 hours later with a new valve, a scar down my sternum, and the knowledge that I'd outlived the worst of myself. Recovery was painful, both physically and in every other way. Robert resigned from the company, after a final boardroom confrontation where he accused me of emotional manipulation. He was right about some of it, wrong about the rest. We haven't spoken since, though I still have his mother's photograph on my desk. I haven't given up on him, but I've stopped trying to force a reconciliation he's not ready for. Some fractures heal only when the other person decides to set the bone. Simon, against all my expectations, stayed. Not as a Cortland heir, he refused the name, the money, the seat on the board. But he kept his job at the hotel, and on Thursdays he comes by the house for coffee. We talk about his grandmother, whose Parkinson's requires full-time care now. I've quietly set up a trust that covers her nursing costs without Simon's signature, because he'd never accept it if I asked. He still calls me Thomas, not Dad. That might always be true. But last month, when I mentioned I was thinking of stepping back from the company to start a foundation for hospital safety protocols, he offered to help write the ethics guidelines. The man who dropped out of community college wrote a policy document so thorough that my corporate lawyers only made 2 edits. Here's the thing nobody tells you about Switched at Birth stories. The revelation doesn't end with a teary reunion and a matching tattoo. It ends with 2 people, hollowed out by decades of stolen time, sitting across a table trying to find a vocabulary for a bond that has no name. The real question isn't who belongs to whom. It's whether you have the courage to offer what you should have given from the start. I failed Robert that way. I'll spend whatever years I have left trying not to fail Simon. But there's one last detail. A month after the surgery, I was going through Margaret Doyle's old belongings that Simon had let me see, tucked inside a baby book. A cheap one, with a crumbling spine, was a Polaroid taken the day after delivery, a tired young woman holding a newborn, and next to the bundle, a name wristband. I'd assumed it would read Simon Keller, but when I looked closer I saw the ink had bled, the letters smeared. The hospital staff had written in pencil on the back, Mother, Margaret Doyle. Infant, male, 7 LBS 11 Oz, St. Luke's Nursery, Crib B7. A second name, in different handwriting, was lightly penciled above that, Cortland, pending, then crossed out. Some nurse, overworked and underpaid, had started to label the crib with the correct name and then stopped. History had balanced on a single stroke of graphite. A decision, or a hesitation, made in a moment, and 2 lives spun out from that instant, in utterly opposite directions. I sat there, the photograph in my hand, and realized I wouldn't have believed it if someone told me as fiction. But there it was, a small erased note that had cost me 3 decades and given me a second chance I was still learning how to deserve. And if there's a lesson in any of this, it's that the truth doesn't just set you free. It usually demands that you build something better in the space it leaves behind. That small erased note taught me something I wish I'd understood 40 years ago. The line between family and stranger is thinner than we pretend. It isn't drawn in blood alone, and it certainly isn't secured by a name on a trust. It's drawn in the 1,000 daily moments when you choose attention over convenience, compassion over control, and the hard, quiet work of showing up even when no one's watching. I'd spent decades building an empire from a single machine shop. The inventory was always precise, the margins razor thin. But I'd never once audited the most important asset I had, the kind of father I was becoming. The hospital swap was an accident. The man I let myself become was a series of choices, and those belong entirely to me. I still think about Robert. He's out there, somewhere, carrying the same fury he walked out with. I don't know if he'll ever forgive me, or if he'll ever understand that the thing he was fighting to inherit was never the company. It was the certainty of belonging, and I took that from him. Not with the DINA test, but with every year I spent treating him like a project instead of a person. I hope he finds a version of himself that doesn't need to measure love in shares and titles. And I hope, one day, he's strong enough to knock on my door without armor. I'll leave it unlocked. Simon still comes by on Thursdays. We've moved from coffee to the occasional chess game, which he wins roughly 3 out of 4 times. He doesn't call me Dad, but last week he handed me a poem he'd written, folded into a neat square. It was about a bridge built in 2 directions at once. I read it 3 times, and then I put it in the drawer where I keep my wife's photograph and the Polaroid of Margaret Doyle. Some things don't need to be displayed to be permanent. If you followed this story from the beginning, you might be wondering what the real resolution is. Is it the surgery? The trust fund? The confession? I think it's simpler. The resolution is the fact that a waiter, who had every reason to walk away, chose to stay. Not because he owed me anything, but because he decided that being the kind of person who helps is its own reward. That's not my legacy. It's Margaret Doyle's. And the greatest gift I can give her memory is to become a man worthy of having crossed paths with her son. So here's my question for you, and I mean it genuinely. What would you do if the foundation of your life cracked in half? Would you cling to the pieces, or would you start building something you're not ashamed to leave behind? That's the question I'm still answering every morning when I wake up, still sore from the surgery, still learning to listen before I speak. Some lessons come too late to change the past, but they arrive exactly in time to rewrite the future. Thank you for spending this hour with me. If this story meant something to you, if it made you think about the people you belong to, or the people you might be missing, then hit that like button and subscribe. It's the simplest way to tell us you want more stories like this, and it genuinely helps keep this whole thing alive. Drop a comment below and let me know, what's one thing you would rebuild if you had a second chance? I read them. I don't always reply, but I read every single one. And if you're new here, welcome, my name is Thomas Cortland. I used to think the only thing that mattered was what you built. Now I know that who you build it with, and who you become along the way, is the only inventory that counts. I'll see you in the next one.